It's a dark night in mid-January. Walking along the foot of Pikes Peak, you wonder if there's even any world outside the dark and cold all around you. Stumbling forward, you come across a torchlit sign, the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Wandering inside, you encounter a scene like a man wandering out into the world for the very first time. Tables are filled with people laughing and discussing art's relationship to faith and faith's relationship to art. In the far corner, by the fire, you encounter two particularly jolly-looking guys at what must be the cool table. And it is. It's the Believe to See table at the Anselm Society Digital Pub table.
We can't talk good, but we are so cool.
If you're cool, you don't need to talk good. I'm one of your co-hosts, Matt Millema, and I'm joined, as always, by Marcus Robinson. Marcus, how are you?
Man, I'm doing pretty good. Yeah, it was a nice freak snowstorm today in Colorado.
Yes.
That was exciting. They didn't call school, even though it was more snow than what they had when they did call school. It's all about the timing, people.
It's all politics.
It is politics, I'm sure.
Now, they say mid-January is the most depressing time of the year. Have
depressing?
You been yes, it's when most people feel the most depressed.
More depressing than the holidays?
Yeah.
You're kidding me.
I feel depressed. Am I the only one? Yeah.
You just need a hug.
Okay.
I'm here for you.
Well, anyway, that's not why we're here. Although that is a decent segue because...
Hugs?
No.
No. Okay. Different thing. Sorry.
Because we want to talk about caves. Well, not just caves, but caves are involved. But more particularly comics that are built around the cave concept.
What was the segue there? Is it a cave of depression?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Just helping the listeners as well, in case you're
back,
like me.
We are back on the same page now.
Good.
So our guest, and this is something we've been reviewing their materials and some stuff they're sending us. I'm really, really excited about this. I think this is a very cool thing, and I cannot wait until they're just about to hit the ground running, or they're just starting doing that. I am so excited to have them on. So we have on the show today, joining the Digital Pub Table, Mandi Hart from Cave Picture Publishing. Mandi, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you guys digitally.
Yes, we're all at the same pub table in this modern age. But so for those of us who maybe aren't familiar, because this is still launching, tell us a little bit about Cave Picture Publishing and maybe a little bit about how you got connected with it.
Sure. So Cave Pictures Publishing is a new comic book and graphic novel publishing venture. We officially launched about 18 months ago, but our first title hit stores in January, so we are still relatively new to the marketplace.
Still hot off the presses.
Absolutely, yes. And we are a wall for modern myth-making. So going to your comment about caves, we draw our company name partially from Plato's allegory of the cave, and the idea that human beings, for most of recorded history, have processed their own existence and questions of meaning via art, beginning with cave paintings thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. So up to the present, we are developing comic books and graphic novels as a continuation of that human exploration of those deep questions via art forms. And the wonderful thing about comics and graphic novels is that they bring together several art forms in one package. Mm-hmm. And they're accessible for readers of all ages. Certainly our content is available to those that both identify with a particular faith tradition, as well as those that do not, but are all commonly journeying on this universal quest of human existence and asking those deep questions that have always been a part of the human experience.
So that's an interesting way to say it. So you guys are not marketing yourselves as necessarily a Christian label, so to speak?
Correct, yes. So none of we are not doing adaptations of stories from the Bible or explicitly Christian content, but all of our stories have deeper questions that Christians and other monotheists and many that don't identify with any particular faith tradition can all identify with. Questions of moral responsibility, questions of where did I come from, what is my significance, and where am I going?
That's great.
Yeah, so along those lines, I noticed I think one of your taglines is that these are stories for the spiritually inclined. So
Yes.
I'm just wondering, it's almost, I don't mean to make this like a crass marketing question, but I'm sure it's a tough line to walk too, because you don't want to be too broad, but you don't want to be, like you said, if you label yourself as explicitly Christian, then you might be cutting yourself off to people who'd be interested in the stories. So why did you decide to land where you did in that very complicated spectrum?
Sure. And you're right. It is a difficult line to walk. And probably what landed us there is wanting to reach as broad an audience as possible with our content without emptying it of that deeper spiritual significance. Mm-hmm. So through our content, we try to raise a lot of very provocative questions, mm-hmm. going back to the questions of moral responsibility and human significance. And certainly we individually have answered those questions for ourselves. But our goal is not so much to answer the questions for readers as it is to raise those questions, maybe hint at some answers or hint at some ways to navigate those questions, but not necessarily provide kind of a cut and dry message or a cut and dry answer for them. Actually, one of our creators probably said it best at a panel that we did last fall in LA. He said for himself personally, as an artist, that is always his goal, to raise questions and to begin an internal dialogue within his reader. And that's very much what we're trying to do.
So, I remember when DreamWorks was started, that mm-hmm. kind of the story that I guess inspired the launch of DreamWorks was The Prince of Egypt. And it was mm-hmm. to tell that story. Is there a story that was, I don't know, the inspiration for you guys to start this publishing company?
I don't know that there was one particular story. Our publisher, Mark Rogers, who's also the founder, he's been a lifelong fan of comics and has been very plugged into the industry, certainly for most of his personal life and also a good chunk of his professional life. And he's, over the years, had met several creators within the industry, many of whom are very highly regarded. And some of them shared stories with him that they had come up with and had not found a platform to produce those. And at the same time that he was thinking about, goodness, these great creators in the comics industry who want to tell these sorts of stories and can't find the outlet. He's mulling over that at the same time that he was actually coming up with his own story, which is our third title, The Blessed Machine. Okay. And he was inspired by Ian Forster's short story, The Machine Stops, and developed his own original story inspired by that short story of over a century ago. And that was another kind of impetus to start Cave Pictures Publishing as an outlet for stories of deeper significance that are much easier to get to a broad audience than if you tried to produce a film or an animated video based on it.
Great. So that I really want to talk about the titles you have for the first launch. I want to dive into it, but before we do, there are a couple questions I want to get to first. I guess the first one, you talked about the cave in terms of, that the cave is in, going back to like earliest man trying to create art and creating these myths on cave walls. But you also had you had sort of a short introductory based off of Plato's allegory of the cave. Mm-hmm. So I'm guessing that is, you have a dual meaning there. So tell me why Plato's allegory is such a central thing for your publishing house.
Oh, sure. We did a comic version of Plato's allegory as a promotional item for caves. You can actually find that online. But certainly the allegory itself, the idea of these individuals that have been chained in a cave all their lives, watching what they think is reality, which are actually just shadows, hiding or just reflections of a bigger reality, that when one of them is unchained, is able to turn around and see, oh, wow, everything that I thought was real and true is actually not. It's just a reflection. That resonates with us very strongly. And the idea of so much of what we see as human beings is pointing at a greater reality that we're on a quest to discover. So the idea of the natural world hints at the supernatural. And certainly art in and of itself, all of these forms of human creativity and beauty are evidence of that link between the natural world and the supernatural, where you're aspiring, you're reaching beyond what is just material to something greater and something more lasting.
Great. Yeah, and just a quick note to the readers, like I've read that promotional story based on the allegory, and it's really great, so definitely check it out if you get the chance. So other question I wanted to establish before we get going is the comic genre in general. So I guess first set of questions there is, I'm in my early 30s, early everyone, but I feel like even since I was a kid, comics have shifted a little bit, where when I was a kid, there was this sort of, it was pejorative in the sense that it was like this thing for like, it's silly superhero stories, et cetera, but now it seems like, I might be just be inferring based on my growing knowledge, it's capable of telling more serious stories, it's taken more seriously as a serious art form. So is that something that has been going on? And also, just what made the comic genre in general so appealing for you to use for your modern myth-making?
Sure. So the first part of the question, absolutely, you're spot on that comics are such an art form and are really in many ways now a subgenre of literature. There are a lot of graphic novels that have won top literary prizes. And maybe one of the most prominent in terms of its standing and longevity is Mouse, which I believe has been a couple decades since it was published, and it tackles the very difficult subject matter of the Holocaust as a graphic novel, and does so in a very winning way, and in a way that makes that whole episode of history a little more accessible for younger readers, and it's kind of it's a nice bridge to some really atrocious historical events for a younger audience that it wouldn't be appropriate for them to be reading and seeing the actual visuals from that historical account. So you're right that graphic novels have certainly come into their own as an art form and gained a lot of prominence, and many of them have been optioned into films. And that is part of the answer to the second part of your question in terms of, well, why comics? Well, while film and video is quite a dominant medium now, it's not as accessible to produce, at least not in as high quality a fashion as many stories demand. So if you want to produce a superhero story, but you want to do it in a feature-length film version, you've got to raise tens of millions of dollars, as opposed to, well, if you create a superhero comic, it's much more cost-effective, and it's also less expensive for the consumer to access, as opposed to having to pay the cost of a ticket to see a film in theaters, or wait weeks or months for it to come out on streaming or DVD or whatever you choose. So that was one of the primary motives for comics. It's just its accessibility.
So
as producers and to consumers.
Yeah. Is the comic book world, is it kind of similar to what's happening a lot in publishing and music, where there's a lot more independent production happening?
I would say that, yes, there is a lot more independent production, There's also, I mean, certainly the big publishers continue to produce a large quantity of comics, DC, Marvel, Image Comics, so on and so forth. And there's also, I believe, a growing number of artists who are charting their own path and doing creator-owned comics and self-publishing. It's been interesting to see the amount of crowdfunding around comics, some of which is successful and some of which is not. But for the artists that have built a business out of it, they've done very well.
Yeah, so related to that, I was wondering how you deal with sort of hardback comics versus the digital realm, because I'm just thinking to a lot of the comics that I read regularly, they're digital, and some of them really take advantage of the fact that they're digital. You know, like they'll use the fact that we have to scroll down the page as like a visual tool in the storytelling. So was that a consideration that you were trying to figure out, like, do we want to stick with like the hardback versus digital, and how did you navigate those waters?
Sure. So our business model has basically 3 stages of distribution. The first being the single issue floppy comics distributed directly to comic shops. We wanted to prioritize, at least to begin with, prioritize the comic shops as the outlet, both in honor of their longevity in the industry and their willingness to tough out what can be a very difficult business, but also through a desire to draw new readers into comic shops. I think sometimes those shops could have a reputation for a particular type of content that many of the new readers we hope to attract would not. The assumption would be that they wouldn't want anything that shop would carry, and we want to somewhat try to break that stereotype.
So I'm picturing the comic book guy in The Simpsons. Is that who we're talking about?
Well, sometimes I think they can look very dark, spiritually very dark, or just look like it's more focused on horror or focused on just dark material instead of stories that are good, true, and beautiful, is one of the ways we like to describe our content. And so trying to draw new readers and new patrons into comic shops is kind of the second half of that, second side of that coin of why we decided to go to comic shops first, wanting to support the shops in part by bringing in new readers. And then digital distribution is our second wave of distribution for all of our titles. The individual issues will be available for purchase on Comixology and via Kindle about 2 months after they hit shops. And then when all the single issues have been distributed individually, we'll be compiling the full series, each series, into a graphic novel compilation, and then distributing the compiled version as the third stage. And remains to be seen with each individual title whether we'll co-publish with an established publishing company, or whether we'll go independent, or whether we'll crowdfund a compiled version. We're going to take each title on its own because they are also distinct.
So along those lines, is there any stage where you talked about the new readers? I'm kind of picturing the general reader who reads a lot of books, maybe doesn't consider themselves a comic book reader. Correct me if that's wrong. Do you expect to get them the most at the digital stage, or do you think you can get them in the comic shops? What are your thoughts with that?
Well, certainly our goal is to get them into comic shops, and we're trying every method we can think of just to get our name out there and to reach those readers and let them know that if they want the floppy comics, to visit their local comic shop. So we featured that very prominently on our social media. We've reached out to connections that we have in the entertainment industry and in other industries that we think would have a following in their own right, a following amongst those readers, and asked for their help to help promote our titles and let potential readers know that they can go to the comic shop right now and order this title. Issue 1 of Appalachian Apocalypse was our first one out. So trying to just get the word out to readers that going to the shop and ordering the title directly from the shop owner is the best way to go, and it's the quickest way to get the content in their hands. We exhibited at some Comic-Cons last fall. We'll be at 2 different retailer conventions this spring, but we're also going to go to 3 homeschooling conventions this spring and try to connect with some homeschoolers, because particularly with content that's based on established literary works like E.M. Forster's short story and like George MacDonald's fairy tales. We've done an adaptation of his fairy tale, The White Princess. We think that content has excellent educational value. And so wanting to reach out to homeschoolers that obviously they have a focus on education, but also likely a focus on faith. And so wanting to reach out to that community as well and let them know that our content is out there, and encourage them, if they're comfortable, to go to comic shops and ask for the titles there.
All right. So I really want to talk about the titles now, because
Appalachian Apocalypse.
Yeah, you gave us. We've read a list of the titles, a quick synopsis of it, read a first selection of one of them, and so first of all, I want to talk about the whole myth making concept, because we talk about modern myth making, and when we think of myths, I think we think of these big grandiose stories, and some of these definitely seem like they're big stories. Is that one of the things you have in mind with myth making, or can you see them being some more smaller stories mixed in with the big stories? How do you see myth making worked out as your publishing progresses?
Sure. So I would say it's probably both in terms of small stories and big stories. All of our titles will run as a multi-issue series that is bounded within that single series, but also allow for additional stories kind of branching off of that. So, for example, our first series, Appalachian Apocalypse, while it will be self-contained, there are seeds there to do additional stories. And when it comes to kind of the grandiose myth a la Middle-earth and Narnia, the 2 big myths from the 20th century, we would love to be the platform for the big myth of the 21st century. Going back to the question of why comics, it's such a medium of the age, this combination of visual and written textual storytelling, all integrated together quite seamlessly, is very much a product of our 21st century digital age and the technology, how it is. So we would love to discover or to develop the next Narnia, the next Middle-earth. And our superhero series is probably the largest of the universes that are being created within our first titles. But we are very cognizant of that aspiration to develop that level of mythology.
So maybe we could talk about your method behind selecting your initial titles, because going through we have one, it's a retelling of George MacDonald fairy tale, we have sci-fi, we have superheroes, we have a zombie apocalypse, a lot of stuff seems kind of genre melding. So how did you land on the titles that you did for the first launch?
Sure. So it's a combination of methods. 2 of our stories are wholly original content that, in one instance, it was the creator that developed it. So that's our superhero series. The author came up with the concept, and he'd been mulling over it for years, literally years, and had the opportunity or the outlet to actually publish it. So we partnered with him to develop that series. The zombie series was actually originated by a couple of our editorial advisors, and the primary gentleman who came up with that idea identified the artist team that he wanted, at least the writer that he wanted to take the concept and write it out, and that's Billy Tucci. And then we had landed on The Light Princess because we wanted to bring George MacDonald's work to a broader audience. It's amazing to think of how influential kind of his godchildren in the genre were. Yeah. G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and Madeleine L'Engle and Lewis Carroll. And yet George MacDonald, in a lot of ways, he's just not as well known, even though he was quite prolific and had a profound impact and in many ways developed the genre that we know as fantasy and fairy stories. So we wanted to develop or to adapt The Light Princess into a comic format to make his works more accessible and bring them to prominence. And then the last story is The Blessed Machine, which, as I mentioned earlier, our publisher, Mark Rogers, originally wrote as a screenplay, and then we partnered with Jesse Ham to convert the screenplay into a comic series, and he's both writer and illustrator of that series.
All right, so let's start with The Light Princess, because we read the first several pages of it, and it was really interesting. One of the things, so a couple things struck me. First of all, like you said, George MacDonald, totally agree. One of those extremely influential writers who very few people realize how important he was. And second of all, this story, it's a really interesting story, but it's also a really weird story. I mean weird in a good way. So maybe if you wouldn't mind just giving a quick synopsis of the story of The Light Princess and why you thought it worked particularly well as a vehicle for showcasing George MacDonald to a broader audience.
Sure. So the story synopsis is a princess who has been cursed with weightlessness. She has no gravity, either physical or emotional, and she has to be tethered to the earth in order to prevent floating away. But the fact that she lacks gravity means that she also, not only can she not just exist normally on the earth, has to be tied down, she also doesn't have any real human connection. She doesn't know what it is to have emotional gravity. So to experience true joy, to experience true frustration or anger, to experience true sorrow. And that keeps her from really connecting and relating on a truly human level. And she exists that way until, of course, a prince shows up, and he ends up demonstrating love to her, sacrificial love, in a way that breaks the curse and that restores her gravity, both physical and emotional.
Yeah.
So,
the artwork is just amazing in the piece, what we saw, and I mean, it really does pop, and it pulls you in like a comic should.
Yeah, and one of the things I noticed, it's so interesting because the concept is capable of being very funny and light and silly. And it's also capable of showing a lot of pathos and a lot of serious emotion. So I'm guessing in your interactions with the team behind it that was probably a hard balance to strike, to have something that is, because one of the major art pieces for it was a baby who's like floating toward the ceiling, and the baby's laughing and giggling, so it's a very silly picture, but there's also a very serious message too. So how did they go about balancing that?
Well, the writer who adapted it, Meredith Finch, has just been an absolute gift. She just so understood the many layers of meaning in the story. And from the very first treatment that she sent us, she was spot on thematically in fleshing out all of the layers. And so she provided a great foundation, a great roadmap for the artist team.
So you guys solicited her?
Yes,
okay.
Yes. We had reached out to her, and she gratefully accepted the project, and was just, I mean, she just nailed everything. We had very little feedback for her with each submission that she sent us other than, this is excellent, we love it, keep going. And then the artist team, Renee and Ray, they do such incredible artwork. Just the way that they use color and light and can capture emotion on the characters' faces is just surreal in many ways. And we chose that particular George MacDonald work because it is so broadly accessible. Very young readers can read it and get the basic fairy tale, while older readers can get the many layers of meaning beneath just the basics. And that was one of the primary reasons that we chose that one, was just its accessibility. Several of his other works are much more complex, much more complicated, and lengthier as well. The Light Princess was much easier to develop into a series, a comic series, and not have to cut out huge swaths of the story.
Wow. Well, it's brilliant because MacDonald is just so, I mean, he's fun. And without being preachy, but he also just has this, I don't know, this gravity, obviously, that inspired Lewis and Tolkien and others. So it is interesting to see that adaptation, and what you guys are doing with that is pretty brilliant.
Yeah, and speaking of, you mentioned earlier how you thought that K Pictures Publishing would sort of provide a platform for works that may not have a platform otherwise. And that struck me reading the synopsis of Appalachian. Is it Appalachian or Appalachian? I was corrected very snootily by someone from the region, and I forget which way I was wrong. But
wait! Isn't that?
Well, I grew up in the region too, and I think I say both.
That's good.
Isn't snootiness just against the region? I mean, that's not what Appalachia or.
Well, there's an apocalypse in that region. And so one of the things I found so fascinating about it is the conceit of it is that someone finds the ancient staff of Lilith, Mother of the Damned, which, if we have a nice little crossover, I believe George MacDonald wrote a work called Lilith. But Lilith is also, very key in sort of the Jewish and Christian, almost mythological tradition. So I'm guessing that is the sort of work that would have fallen through the cracks, but for you providing a platform for it. But tell me what was so appealing about Appalachian Apocalypse.
Sure. Well, number one, a couple of our editorial advisors came up with the idea. So they were able to pitch personally, which was great. They had thought it out so well. There were no plot holes. It was all very clear. And just, it's also a fun story. We've described it as it's Sweet Home Alabama meets The Walking Dead. So it's got all the fun and lightheartedness of
Sweet Home Alabama, the Lynyrd Skynyrd song, or the movie?
No, the rom-com. The rom-com.
Oh, okay.
Meeting The Walking Dead.
Okay. Reese Witherspoon and zombies.
Yeah, so it's got the comedic elements and a little bit of romance, and it's zombies going everywhere. And our artist, Ethan Nicole, just knocked it out of the park. He's amazing. Zombies is not necessarily my genre, personally, but I love seeing what he does, and he's very detail-oriented. So that, and also the different, as you mentioned, the mythology that it draws on, this kind of biblical myth or Jewish myth of Lilith, and at one point the character who finds the staff is trying to figure out, well, is it the staff of Moses? Who does this belong to? Is there actually any historical significance to it? And it raises interesting questions as well about who should have the power to reanimate the dead. Who should get to make that choice? If that power becomes accessible to human beings, is that okay? Or does that present a danger? And the way the story plays out, it hints that maybe that's not a good thing, that for human beings to be able to choose who lives or who dies, particularly if that power is really not meant for human beings and they don't have full control over it. What manifests as reanimated, the reanimated dead are actually the undead, because the power is not meant to be wielded by human hands. So,
Yikes.
yeah.
Yikes.
So that gave me a good idea for my segue. Speaking of power that maybe should not be wielded by human hands,
I'm glad you guys blended it with the rom-com rather than Deliverance. Let me just say that. That would be a very dark combination. Zombies and Burt Reynolds going down the river. So
quick aside.
that.
So
I'll just give thanks.
So my dad was like, just flipped through cable channels one day, and he comes across Deliverance. He'd never seen it, so I was like, Dad, believe me, you don't want to see it. Like, seriously, you don't want to see it. And he's like, oh, it's fine. Then he watches it. He's disturbed, obviously. And then he's mad at me, like, why didn't you stop me from watching it?
Because you're a grown man.
All right, Dad.
Yeah.
But anyway, back to the regularly scheduled podcast. One of the titles I think is really interesting is you're going into the superhero genre, which, in case any of you listeners haven't heard, is quite hot right now. So the No Ones seems to take it in a different direction, and a direction I think is really interesting. So tell me why you decided to get into superhero game, and what you thought this title would add to that world.
Sure. So the author and originator of the No Ones, Jim Kruger, is famous in the comics world for his work in that genre. So that was one of the things that really attracted us to this story, was just his own reputation and longevity in developing superhero stories. And not just superhero stories that are kind of light and on the surface, and you read them and walk away and never think about them again. But he's very thoughtful in his approach. And with this particular series, The No Ones, it's a fascinating premise where you have this team of superheroes that have become corrupted by their own fame. They've developed this corporate brand as a team and are global superstars, and it's completely corrupted them to the point that they've actually become anti-heroes. They're all quite hypocritical, and one records PSAs against smoking and drug use, but when the cameras are gone, he's lighting up a cigarette. And the married couple that is supposed to be kind of not just America's sweethearts, but the world's sweethearts, have actually secretly divorced. And so at the very beginning, we set up that this team has become kind of morally hollowed out by their own fame, and then by a twist of fate, they get erased from past and present memory. All of a sudden, they still have the same powers, the same capabilities, but they're no longer able to be recognized or remembered. And so that sets up this interesting moral dilemma of, what do you do with your power when you no longer can be held responsible or be recognized for its use? You can either rise to the occasion and become a true hero by utilizing it for good, even though you're never going to get any reward from it, or you allow it to corrupt you even further by wielding it for your own selfish aims, knowing that no one can hold you accountable for it. And so all of the team members have to decide which direction they're going to go at that fork in the road. And so that premise in and of itself, we found very, very compelling and right in line with Cave's mission of raising those deeper questions about moral responsibility and what does it mean to live a significant life and the good life.
So it sounds like, feel free to just completely brush me aside if I'm off. Sounds like, here's my pitch for it. It's a Wonderful Life meets Groundhog Day meets The Avengers. Boom. But
yeah.
but anyway, so that sounds
yeah.
So that sounds really fascinating, and I guess my more serious follow-up question is, do you view this as sort of speaking something into the superhero genre as it's sort of grown and expanded over the years, or do you view it as sort of a more of its own encapsulated story?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I mean, from Jim's perspective, I'm not sure if he was thinking that in some respects the story is speaking into the superhero genre, perhaps. But certainly in our cultural moment, with the rise of so many strong corporate brands, both actually corporate and individual. I mean, living in the digital age, an age of social media, individuals can have very powerful brands. And with the way that social media works and how quickly things can spread, those brands and the use of those platforms can go one way or the other and do so quite quickly.
Yeah, so along those lines, I was wondering if you could talk about these new superhero movies, which I'm guessing the listeners have heard are quite all over the place. So from your perspective, someone who's in the actual comics industry, is this a good thing because it brings more notoriety and more publicity to it? Like, everybody knows all about Spider-Man and Captain America now, whereas maybe they wouldn't have. Or do you think this is kind of just diluting the true form of the comic and making them basically incubators for big Hollywood productions that are the result of like huge corporations?
It's an interesting question. In a lot of ways, I find them very distinct, both the comics and the movies. I mean, the readership of comics is much smaller than the viewership of the films. And so while the comics themselves may be kind of the starting place for the development of these characters and these plot lines, there's a lot further they're going to go than just the comic shop, just the comics reader, when Hollywood kind of options it into a film. I would say that the blockbuster films that have come out based on comics in the last decade have made DC and Marvel household names. And so in a lot of ways, they've taken comics mainstream, at least as a kind of cultural concept, even if the average film viewer is not going to a comic shop to buy the floppy comics of Superman or Wonder Woman. There is at least more awareness. And certainly all the conventions around the industry, whether comics or anime or video games or manga, there's so many of them, WizardCon, WonderCon, they're just exploding in popularity. And it seems like every small town in America now has their own version of Comic-Con. I'm originally from the state of North Carolina, and little towns like Hickory and Statesville and Fayetteville all have their own Comic-Con. And so in that respect, comics have gone mainstream, and everyone wants to, it recognizes those characters, recognizes the stories, and to some extent, wants to engage with those, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Depends on who you ask. Some comics fans feel like maybe this isn't the best.
Yeah, that was a thoughtful and nuanced response. Part of me was hoping you'd give like this fiery hot take, but I think your response was probably better objectively. Along those same lines, in a sense, I've been wondering about the difference between viewing a comic digitally and viewing it, just a paperback. Because most of my comic reading is done digitally. So I'll read a digital comic, or I'll get a comic to like my Kindle, which I usually just read off my phone, which is not ideal on a phone. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts just on the difference of the experience between reading one, that's printed paper, reading one digitally, and how you think that has really changed the landscape.
Well, certainly digital distribution, particularly on a tablet or on a smartphone, has presented some interesting questions to creators and then to the designers of the different software and the different distribution platforms as to whether and how to adapt the medium in order to optimize viewing in that context. For decades, hard copy, physical distribution was all there was. But now with all these different screen sizes and orientations and different distribution platforms in the digital space, there's some interesting questions as to how do you adapt comics for that space. And we've chosen to go both routes, to do both floppy and digital. So in many ways, like, we want our titles to be as accessible as broadly as possible. So for those that would only want to read in physical form, then they can get the floppy from the shop. And I like holding it in my hand and flipping the pages. But for those that would prefer to read digitally, that's part of the impetus for distributing on both Comixology and Kindle, is to reach as broad an audience as possible. So I would say as a company, as a publisher, we don't have a position one way or the other. We recognize that there are individuals that are going to gravitate towards one versus the other, and the more that we can reach, the better.
All right, so one final question for you, because we're running low on the time for this episode, but I'm curious because I am a lawyer, and I saw in your bio that you also graduated from law school before getting into this work. So how did you transition from law school to being in the creative realm? How did you do this?
Well, before I was a lawyer, I was a filmmaker. So I got my MFA in film production and worked for a couple of years for a documentary filmmaking company, producing mostly short videos for international development organizations. But story has always been closest to my heart. And through a confluence of events, I went to law school always with the intent to go back into creative content development, broadly speaking. Film is probably my first love, but any intellectual property I can get behind. So that, in a nutshell, was kind of how I ended up here with Cave. I first met Mark actually through a documentary series that we were working on, and about the time that was winding down, the comic book venture was taking off. So I just transitioned from one to the other, and in a lot of ways it was somewhat astounding to me that I had not come across comics earlier, particularly after having worked in film, because in many ways comics are just a very beautiful and detailed storyboard for a film. And it was kind of shocking to me that I had not come across the format earlier. But it's been fascinating to work in. It's been such a great learning experience. It's such a unique industry. And yeah, and I've learned a lot and have loved meeting the artists that we've worked with and seeing all the distinct stories that we're developing come together, and now we're hitting the market. So hopefully readers will be as attracted to the stories as we are.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mandy, for joining us. This was really interesting. And once again, listeners, it's Cave Pictures Publishing. Depending on whether you want to go to the comic store or read it digitally, they're either newly available or will be available soon. And from what we've read so far, they look really interesting. I'm really excited to really dive into them. And yeah, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Yeah. Is there a website that you can give out?
Yes. It is cavepicturespublishing.com.
Fantastic.
All right. So now, Marcus, take us home with a St. Anselm quotation.
All right. So we read these Anselm quotations at the end of every episode with no context. So here you go. St. Anselm said, It is therefore not proper for God thus to pass over sin unpunished. So until next time, bye-bye.